I'm leading, in part with the great support of NEFE, a team of researchers, all starting at Ohio State. Many have moved on, beginning as students and moved on. We're calling it the Credit, Debt, and Inequality Lab. It's not quite as encouraging as the Hope Lab, but perhaps I need to rethink my public relations. But I just want to acknowledge that I have the support of those scholars, and to thank NEFE again for their generosity and guidance and support and encouragement to talk to broad publics. My work is very broadly engaging the question of whether and how much inequality and insecurity has gone up in American society. I'm a sociologist by training. I do some demography. And so I think a lot about population level dynamics. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really taking a bunch of steps back, or up to the 30,000 foot level, and think about the broader context where the learners, the students that we're talking about and thinking about, all of us in our own ways, engage questions about financial decisions. Again, Carly and Chris gave me a real nice introduction to, and again, I don't need to say this here in this audience, that debt is not just a good or a bad thing. That it's something that can be both a resource and a liability, and it's that, of course, at different times and across different people and different groups, and so that what scholars like to call heterogeneity, which is a terrible word, what other people like to call variation and diversity, really drives experiences of debt. And that this fact, this has always been true of debt, is a foundational characteristic of credit and debt, of course, but it's newly, and when I say newly, I mean, the past couple decades, newly important in U.S. society because of changes that not everyone agrees on how to characterize, but I think Jacob Hacker, the political scientist, has said it really concisely, a society in which there's been a shift of risk, an increasing burden of risk on individuals and households away from the public sector, both states, both the federal government, states, and local entities as well. Though local entities have, including entities like colleges and universities, are trying to step in and fill in some of that gap. So regardless of, people disagree about the extent to which this has happened and how one should characterize it, but I think this is helpful for us to think through today. And this means that one of the consequences of the great risk shift that Jacob Hacker doesn't emphasize as much as I do and others who are working in this area is the increasing importance of credit and debt to just getting by and making a decent life for oneself in U.S. society. You all know this. You're trying to help young people navigate that. I will remind us that this is something that, although many are not particularly well educated, in fact, many are yet nevertheless aware that this is the case. So this is a simple graph of an answer to a question to the Survey of Consumer Finances. Is credit, is taking on debt a good idea or a bad idea, or is it good in some ways and bad in other ways? And you can see that over time, from the early 80s to the later 20-teens, the idea that it's just a good idea has dropped. The idea that it's just a bad idea has gone up a bit, but what's gone up the most is this middle ground. It's good in some ways, bad in others. So this is a broad perspective that we all have, and of course, you are trying to help teach young people how to navigate that. I'm interested in youth for a number of reasons. I'm not an education scholar. I'm not someone who started off studying young adults. Instead, I was someone concerned about inequality and insecurity in American society, as I said. But I got increasingly interested in youth at risk. The youth, of course, are a cohort of people exposed to these shifts most consequentially. They're at a stage in their life course, as you know, where they're making a lot of financial decisions, and they are engaging this kind of historic increase in precarity in labor markets, in health care markets, in other kinds of institutions at the same time as there are growing educational divides. So students are making decisions, young people are making decisions about taking on, about investing in college while they're getting pressed from many sides. And it's not that that's entirely new, of course, but the more recent cohorts of young adults are really particularly squeezed, and of course the Great Recession just adds another intense emergency to that dynamic. I won't say much about this. We know student loans have gone up. So what I want to do is shift then to, why is this doing this? Okay. What I want to do is shift a little bit to the question of student loans. So if we're worried about young adults, if increasingly getting a college degree is required to have a decent standard of living, we see increasing educational divides in income, access to home ownership, all kinds of goodies that go along with middle class life in the United States. We, of course, immediately, once we start thinking about young adults and getting to college, think about student loans. And again, Carly and Chris set me up well here because they have a very similar perspective that I do, that there's a lot of, there's debate about this, but there's a lot of language in the culture that we're living through a student loan crisis. And you know that story. It's in the pages of the New York Times quite regularly. And then there's a lot of scholars who say, yeah, you know, especially economists, I will say, yeah, I get that you know, you think there's a crisis, but actually these problems are often overstated. They are concentrated, so there's certain subsets of students who really struggle most with loans. There's problems with people not taking on enough loans. And by the way, student loans are a whole heck of a lot better than credit card debt. And so there's this a kind of incipient, there's this debate which I think is more in the pages of, you know, more in academic circles. In the public, the sort of idea of a crisis is, I think, more well accepted. I think, of course, not surprisingly, that it's a bit in the middle. I don't think that it's proper to characterize this as a student loan crisis. In fact, I think that if we do bang that drum too hard, what that does is it reinforces the idea that students should not go to college, not invest in college, and it also, I think, is part of attacking that public good of higher education. So I think those of us in this field who care about higher education need to think about having nuanced discussions about this that help people understand what the role of the student loan system really is. At the same time, I don't actually agree with the folks who are, and to be honest, this sort of the problems are overstated is getting a little bit less sort of since the Great Recession. That's getting a little bit more nuanced. Say 10, 15 years ago, it was more likely that some would say, well, it's not a problem at all. But in fact, I think that while some of the problems are overstated, it's also the case that the problem is understated. And so one of the ways, or misstated. So the argument that I'm going to be making to you today is that when we think about student loans, we really, to understand their effect for young adults, we need to think about loans in context. And that's what I see my role here today, is trying to bring to you some of the knowledge that I've gained through the funded research from NEFE about that broader context. I'm not the only one doing this work. Of course, Sarah Goldrick-Rabb and her colleagues, Eddie is here from her new shop at Temple, have been really leading the charge and putting more of a spotlight on the issue of precarity in higher education. So that students come to colleges with a lot of other things that they're managing, and many of you know this far better than I do, those of you who are meeting with students and trying to design programs to help students know that students are facing homelessness and food insecurity and all kinds of other issues. So I see myself as being sort of part of this growing consensus that we need to think more about the broader context of precarity and security for young adults going to college. But I'm also coming to this with a particular perspective, and a perspective that I think a lot of people at NEFE and connected to NEFE share, which is, of course, debt. So I'm going to say more about debt in a minute. There are prior research just in general on student debt, as well as thinking about precarity in student debt, has a number of limitations. Let me say that, you know, for my limitation is someone else's opportunity, and so I don't want to be. Please don't interpret me as suggesting that people who've made decisions to limit their focus in various ways, including our fine presenters earlier today, are, you know, that's a bad decision for what they're doing. In many cases, it makes sense to limit to the four-year college case. In many cases, it makes sense to focus on student loans because you're worried exclusively or explicitly about student loans. And many, for many studies, for many people, it makes sense to focus on the college years. But what this means is that a lot of the research is really focused in these places and spaces. We don't know as much about some other folks, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. And truth be told, this is partly driven by the data. That a lot of the best data we have on student loans is coming out of data sets like Bachelors and Beyond, which is focused on people who go to four-year colleges during the college years, although Beyond gets us a little bit later, but then the sample sizes get smaller. So some of it is data-driven. So what the grant, and of course, actually the grant is a lot bigger than what I'm talking about today. I'm trying to focus on a particular set of issues that I think are particularly important in terms of coming out of the grant. What I want to do today is focus on some puzzles in the area of institutional expansion, affordability, and access. So let me say a few words about that before I raise the specific questions. We have these simplifying decisions that a lot of people make, a lot of scholars make, partly come out of an old image of higher ed in the United States, that it is a kind of four-year sector and that these other kinds of institutions are rare. In fact, of course, as you all know, the higher ed sector has always been very open and diverse in the United States, much more open and diverse than, say, in continental Europe, which has a much more regimented system. The United States has always had that school of Pat, I don't see Pat. Do you mind if I mention your daughter?
Yeah.
So, Pat's daughter is at this amazing school for violin making in Chicago. It's just a beautiful idea. And that's the kind of school actually that the U.S. system has always had. Always had a lot of those. Not that we're the only ones. We've always had a lot of different kinds of institutions. But that's grown over time. Of course, I don't need to tell you. We have a lot more two-year colleges. We have a lot more diverse set of college students going to college. So in that context, what we're trying to do here is understand more about the debt, financial precarity, financial insecurity among two-year college students, not just four-year college students, and especially we're going to focus on associate's degree holders. I'll explain more about that in a minute. We're going to be broadening, like Chris and Carly to some extent, broadening from just talking about student loans and talk about all the kinds of debt that students are taking on while they're in college. And then finally, we're trying to push past the college years. So think about financial precarity across the life course, because actually in that sort of discussion about are we in a crisis or are we not in a crisis, I think often what is missed in those discussions is how long many students hold loans, and actually how many students are taking on loans throughout young adulthood. That this is not something that's just concentrated in the 18, 19, 20, 21 years, that it's really extending throughout young adulthood, and the data that I present to you today is part of the reason that I've drawn that conclusion. So I'm going to raise a few questions here. The first two is what I'm probably going to have time for. Do associate's degree holders carry less student debt than more educated degree holders? And do associate's degree holders carry riskier portfolios of debt than more educated students? And I'll say more about this as I get through the data and methods about what I mean by these things. Then I'm going to have a few thoughts or findings to report about consequences and mechanisms, but I'm probably not going to get to them. But I just want you to know that that's where I'm headed, and I've also, that's a little bit less well developed. This is a work in progress. It's not complete, so I'll be excited to hear your feedback. I'd like to step back before we move into the data and methods and say just a few words about why these are puzzles. So Duncan Watts, a great sociologist who Google snapped up and now he works in the tech sector, Duncan Watts has written a book called Everything is Obvious. And I think this is and he says that people are storytellers. And so one of the things we do when we hear the results of research is we say, well, that's obvious. Well, you can find, every result is obvious because you can tell a story about why it should have obviously been so. And so it might seem, well, of course, there are mixed findings in the literature that lead to different hypotheses relative to these questions. So there's some research that suggests, well, associate's degree holders are on average more disadvantaged populations, so we should probably expect them to have more student debt. We should probably expect them to be more financially precarious. On the other hand, a lot of associate's degree holders are choosing community colleges and two-year colleges precisely because they're more affordable, and are living at home and doing, or maybe if they have home, there are complicated situations. And so there's also a set of expectations that maybe they aren't taking on as much student debt and they are just financially precarious. And so what we're trying to do here is get a kind of, like I said, 30,000-foot view. And in addition, we're engaging here partly in the science of discovery, trying to understand more about a population that hasn't been well discussed. Okay, we're going to rely mainly on a longitudinal survey that is developed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a federal publicly available survey. This is really, it was first developed to understand, as you can tell by the sponsor, to understand labor market entry for young adults. Over time, they've expanded their understanding of education and financial matters, which is fantastic. This is a cohort of people who were born in the early 1980s. They're the oldest millennials, if you favor that way of thinking about. They've been interviewed since they were teenagers until basically most of them have turned 30. In the most recent data. I'll also do some supplementing with the survey of consumer finances. The debt measures in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth are pretty good. Of course, we'd like them to be better, but they're pretty good. We have a good set of questions about student loans from all sources. There's questions about other debts, secured debts like houses and cars, unsecured debts, consumer debt. There's a nice, the way they structure this is you have, for most of the data, we have a category called other debts, which is basically credit cards, and then all other debts to businesses, so many other kinds of consumer loans or medical debt and things like that. Then in the last two sets of collection on debts, they actually split the unsecured debt into credit card debt and all other debts to businesses. And so we treat these as the riskiest debts. I think that's reasonable. The question doesn't ask about interest rates and so on, but when we look at the patterns, we're reasonably confident that is capturing pretty risky types of debts, including payday loans and past due rent and the kinds of things that get bill collectors on you. I'm going to say a few words about our analytic design. I think I didn't quite finish that. We're thinking about debt as a set of. We're interested in the mix of debts that young adults hold. So that's one of the ways in which we're operationalizing insecurity. We're saying not just who owes more or who owes more or less student loan debt. We're looking at what's the character of the mix of debts that you carry, and we're associating that with that mix with precarity, with insecurity. That'll be familiar to all of you. We make so we do have to make some simplifying moves. So one of the things, I mean, honestly, this is just getting more and more complicated the more we look into it. When you're trying to capture the entire movement and an entire cohort through the U.S. higher educational system, one might wish for a more, orderly system like the Germans have. But instead, what we have is a very, very diverse and open kind of dynamic where we have students moving in and out of different statuses, sometimes enrolled, sometimes not enrolled, getting degrees, and moving on. And so our simplifying move is we're taking a different simplifying move, and we're focusing on associate degree holders. So what we're saying, and what we're defining them as, we're saying we're dividing our sample into educational groups. And what we're looking at is their degree by age 30, because we're interested in that pathway over time. So we're interested in looking at associate's degree, people whose highest degree earned is an associate's degree, a 2-year degree by age 30. So that's a particular subset of people, and we're comparing them to groups that have more education and to groups who have less education. The people with more education are those with bachelor's degrees or graduate and professional degrees. The people with less education are those with high school or GEDs or no high school degree. Okay, so I'm going to have there'll be 5 groups in various graphs, but what I want you to remember is basically associate's degrees compared to those more educated and less educated. We have banged this around a lot. We've done a lot of robustness tests. We've done some apples to apples trying to see if this is observational data, so we don't have the advantage of experimental design, but we've tried to do our best with that, propensity score matching and other things. What I'm going to be showing you are essentially descriptive summaries of what we have established with more complex, rigorous statistical models underneath them. So it's sort of like the tip of the iceberg, and we've got that work making sure that these differences are real. what I will say in terms of kind of saying just a brief word about generalizability here, although we focus on the associate's degrees holders, I think what we're doing, and we're digging through this now, a lot of what we're concluding about this group is relatively generalizable to anyone with some college, but less than a bachelor's degree. And that makes the group even bigger. So those who have only an associate's, the highest degree as associates by age 30 are about 20% of those who have a degree, okay? And there's a lot of people who don't have a degree who look a decent amount like this population, okay? So that question 1, are associate's degree holders less likely to carry student debt than more educated? Oh, and I didn't say one important thing about our analytic design. Where did I put it? Here. When you're following people across young adulthood, it's really challenging to capture their financial circumstances. And so one of our findings that I need to write up and publish in a methodological piece is that actually the measure that operates particularly well in terms of being reasonably consistent and reliable and kind of summarizing the most amount of information with the greatest parsimony. That measure is whether or not you hold a type of debt. So it's just debt incidence, not levels. Levels matter, of course they matter, right? I mean, we care about how much debt people have, and we especially care about their monthly payment and their debt to income or debt to wealth ratio, or debt to assets ratios. All of those are, of course, measures that we have available to us, and we've worked a lot with them. The problem is that when you have people moving in and out of college, right, they're moving in and out of income streams, and in fact, some of your most advantaged students don't have income over their entire, right? Think about your friend who went to medical school, right? They don't have income until they're 30. And they have a lot of debt. So they're going to look really bad on a debt to income ratio, but it's going to be very misleading. And so what we argue and what we feel confident about is that actually looking at just your likelihood of carrying a particular form of debt and your likelihood of having a particular mix of debts actually summarizes the types of inequalities that we're interested in, at least at this level. I think when you're drilling down and you're trying to do something that's focused on a more maybe specific question, then I think you have to revisit those questions. But everything I'm showing you here will be just your likelihood of carrying particular types of debts. And but we have tested these, especially in the age 30, among the older folks. We've tested to see if we feel that the results are fairly consistent for debt to income and. Well, we have lousy data on monthly payment. That's the other. Any of you, well, you're not collecting data on debt, but boy, we need more data on monthly nuts. Because people don't engage their financial burdens in terms of total amounts only. They maybe do that to some extent. They're asking, how much do I need to pay each month? And we have very, very poor data on that, and not a lot of it. Okay, so let me walk you through. So let me give you the punchline here. They don't carry much less. Associate's degree holders carry a shockingly similar amount of debt well, shockingly, that's too strong. I don't like it when scholars are always like, my result is the most counterintuitive thing you've ever heard. I think they're trying to get away. It's their way of trying to deal with the everything is obvious problem. But associate's degree holders carry relatively similar amounts of debt to more educated. They have relatively similar propensities to carry student loan debt as more educated. Of course, the doctors have more total amounts of debt. So I'm going to start, let me talk to you about how to read this particular set of graphs. So I'm going to have my groups here. This is people who've earned their highest degree earned as an associate's degree by age 30, okay? And do you see the shading on the bars? This one is the age 20, 25, 30. This is how NLS, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, organizes their collection on debt. And you can see that student debt increases across age, not surprisingly, okay? Okay, I'm going to keep saying levels, okay? I was saying to myself, it's a propensity to carry this debt. Of course, associate's degree holders have a greater propensity to carry student debt than those who have only a high school or GED. So those in this category are folks who maybe went to college and didn't get a degree, right? How do they carry student debt if they don't have a degree. They don't have it's because they don't have a degree, but they went to college. The other thing that we're finding, and we don't have a ton of good data on this, is all the people, do you know that when you go to get remedial, people, right, they spend a lot of money on remedial classes and even courses to get it. You can take on student debt to get a GED. You can get access if you're in school to get your GED. You can take it, and that may not be a bad thing. But I'm just, it gives you a sense of the complexity of the student loan issue. It's not so much a crisis as it is a manifestly Byzantine system. That is, talk about something that's difficult to assess the effects of, and I think lots of people are rushing to effects without even understanding kind of who the students are that hold debt. Now let's compare to more educated groups, and you start seeing differences. So, of course, the associate's degree holders less likely to hold debt in younger ages, but the likelihood of holding student debt converges. For the associate's degree holders, converges to the more educated populations over time, over age, okay? This bar, this is age 30, this is age 30. Age 30 degree holders look more similar. They're getting a little closer. The second thing is the bachelor's degree holders start paying off their debts, right? These folks, the debt amount starts going down a little bit with age for the bachelor's degree holders. For these folks, it's still going up. So there's one very simple reason, and I'll tell you a graph about this later, which is that the associate's degree holders tend to be going to college later into their, right, they're going at more variable times. They're entering college later, and they're moving in and out of college, and then potentially having a harder time paying it back. These are some of the kinds of mechanisms that we're exploring in our work now. Postgraduate, similar. This is everybody beyond a bachelor's. This would include masters, PhD, professional students. Okay, same thing. You see this kind of different kind of age trajectory for the associate's degree holders than for the others. So one of our conclusions of the grant is that we think of these associate's degree holders as our strivers, the people who are really trying hard to get somewhere different from where they are and trying hard to take advantage of higher education institutions, and they're doing so under duress. Now, it's not that the bachelor's degree holders or the postgraduate, right, those first-gen students going to become lawyers and doctors, I'm not trying to minimize their struggles or not call them strivers, but we've come to think of them in our shorthand as strivers. So here's the, this is age 20. This is age 30, the likelihood of holding debt. Right, the associates are getting up and trying to get closer to these folks. Now, another thing we find, which I don't have a great way to show you today, is that these folks, a decent number of these folks, are trying to get into the 4-year, right? And they're not all done at this point. So some of what's happening here is their highest degree is an associate's degree, but they've been taking classes at 4-year colleges, and that's one reason why their debt is going up as well. They're not accruing all of that debt at 2-year colleges. Question 2, do associate's degree holders carry riskier portfolios of debt than more educated groups? So I've showed that these associate's degree holders actually are particularly likely to carry, are more likely to carry student debt over time, and they become more similar to more educated groups in their propensity to carry student debt as they get older, okay? Now the question is, how risky, what's the overall financial circumstance of this population? What are they likely to have a more or less risky financial portfolio relative to more educated groups? Like I said earlier, there's some reasons to expect that this group will have a riskier portfolio. They're not as advantaged, right? They're with all the issues of kind of going over longer periods of time, they're more likely to have dependents and so on. But there's also reasons to think, well, they might be credit constrained. They might not have as much access to debt. Maybe they're not taking on quite as much. And then, then there's, of course, I haven't even mentioned this yet. I should be saying this repeatedly, that there's also differences in access to financial education and literacy, and these might drive some of these differences. So what do we find? I'm going to show you a series of graphs that show age trajectories and debt holding. And again, these are relatively descriptive graphs that we've tested with a lot of statistical wizardry. So the age, right, x-axis, proportion in the group holding debt on the y-axis. These are the groups. So you can remember the associates are red, right? I do have a Buckeye color scheme in my presentations, I will admit. The lighter gray are less educated groups, no degree or high school or GED as your highest degree by age 30, and the darker black lines are more educated groups. So you're just comparing those associate's degree holders to the more educated and less educated groups. I kept them separate because it's kind of interesting to see how the five, we have 5 groups. I think you'll be able to follow it. There was one other thing I wanted to say about this. I can't remember. It'll come to me. For most of the debt data you'll recall, I have data for 20, 25, and 30. There's a couple measures at the end that I have for just 25 and 30. Punchline, the associate's degree holders do have a riskier portfolio of debts than the more educated, and there's a way in which, and I'll be interested to hear your feedback on this, there's a way in which actually they look riskier than the less educated groups in a certain sense, and we'll get a sense of what that looks like. Again, it's this kind of striver. So here's the student loan debt that we've already talked about. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I'm letting this y-axis change in each graph because what we're really doing here is we're focusing on the comparison across groups. These groups have different propensities of holding different types of debts. In which case, the spread on the y-axis will vary, but just a warning there. So showing you what we've already talked about here, the propensity to hold student loan debt. More educated, less educated associates degree holders by age 30. Okay, you see this convergence over time. And again, the fact that this group keeps going up into 30, right? They're entering their 30s on a slope. They haven't started, right, as a group on average, right, these are big groups, but they haven't started that downward sloping. We're completing our educational career, we're paying it off. Okay, any debt. So I'm going to separate this out by several different kinds of debt. So this is all debt, any kind of debt at all. Associate's degree holders are essentially indistinguishable from more educated groups in terms of their likelihood of carrying any debts. And it goes all the way close to, you're getting close to 1 here. The transition to adulthood in U.S. society is a transition to holding debt. Debt and credit is an integral part of the transition to adulthood. We all know this. These are the high school or equivalent. These are essentially the high school dropouts or perhaps immigrant groups who come without a high school degree. Okay, so you see this is one reason I think it's valuable to see these is because it's not just that everybody's here, right? That the associate degree holders do look very significantly different from less educated groups, and I think that's very important because it tells us that they're buying some things with that debt, right? They're buying some mobility hopefully, and they look different from these populations. However, once we separate out, as we saw with student loans. Now with student loans, you might say, well, by student loans, the student loans proportions, likelihoods are converging. But when you start separating out the different types of debts, you see that the associate degree holders are getting to here with a different mix of debts than the more educated groups. So it looks more similar than it is. And so this is my pitch for we need to look at the whole portfolio and not just debt holding overall. If we look at secured debts, we see that the associates, people who hold as their highest degree an associate's degree by age 30, though that population has a precocious entry into secured debts, and then they start getting, by secured debts I mean basically house and car. And this would include any kind of house loan. This would be home mortgage, home equity, okay? And then they start getting edged out. So these are folks, right, they're having to leave a parental home faster. They're not in the dorms. They're not having that kind of more cushioned transition to adulthood. They're having to get in early to the secured life. They need a car because they have to get from college to their job. Okay, they can't just walk across the quad. If we look at house debt and car debt, you see actually their house debt, it's especially car debt, and they start falling behind in house debt. Okay, there's car debt. Look at that. Higher and higher the whole time, and that tells you a lot, right? Think about those. When we say, one of the things I think is I find getting through the data in this detail really valuable because I think it makes alive things that we know, but that I think we forget. Right? These are commuting students often. They're students who are mixing work and family. They have to get to the day, right? They have to get to the child care center. And of course, two-year college attenders are very disproportionately female and disproportionately parents. And so what are the results of that for the other kinds of financial decisions they're making? This is, they have to make this as one of them. Some of them might be living in their car. Unsecured debts. This is overall, and it gets more complicated once we start breaking it out. So again, they look a little bit less here. I think probably they have a little bit more, these aren't really significant differences. They look a little bit better here, but they're not better, higher here. But they're basically quite similar to the more educated group. People who are trying to get somewhere in American society, who are trying to engage the educational system, are taking on consumer debt. And of course, Chris and Carly's results suggest that sometimes they're inappropriately substituting or consumer debt for student loans when it would be better for them to be taking out student loans. How am I doing that time? I'm okay. Okay, and you can see, I think right here, the credit constraint potentially, right? That you have these much less educated groups are just not getting access to that consumer debt, whereas the associate degree holders, perhaps because they're in college. And I haven't looked for the Credit Card Act effects. That would be good to look at. Okay, what do I want to do here? When we can split this unsecured debt up. Sorry, I'm making you crazy. So okay, yes. Okay, this includes college. So I misspoke. I think I said this was consumer debt, but this is actually all unsecured debt, including college. This is just consumer debt. That's why I got myself confused. So here you can see over the entire period, those with an associate's degree as their highest degree by age 30 have the highest consumer debt over the whole period. And they do come down, so it's good to see that later in the life course, right, people start trying to moderate, right? They're getting the jobs, they're getting the houses and so on. They're starting to moderate, but they're not. In fact, these groups their slope is a little steeper than the others. A lot of this is driven by, unfortunately, we can't split this up except in 25 to 30. So we need to do a little bit more work to really understand what's happening in the earlier periods. What we can see is that the least educated groups, non-high school GED and associate's degree holders are much more likely to be carrying the riskiest types of consumer debts, which is that catch-all category of everything other than credit cards, right? Other debts to businesses other than credit cards. So payday loans, title loans, auto loans, it's not auto loans, payday loans, title loans, tax return loans, past due rent, medical debt is there. We're not sure. One of the things I'd really like to know is how people interpret this. We assume it's underreported because maybe people don't think about the past due bills as being in there. That's one of the things I'm working on, say, over the next 5 to 10 years is trying to get better data on that kind of debt. We don't think that legal debt is included here. So when you may have read Alexis Harris's work that suggests that a lot of low-income people encountering the criminal justice system are carrying legal fines, fees, restitutions, and so on. So we're not sure if that's caught here. This is probably an underestimate, but again, the upshot is that this group is carrying a riskier portfolio compared to other groups. We were interested in, we wanted to check our expectation that this would include things like fringe banking. So we looked actually at the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is not a cohort survey, so it's a broader cross-section of the population, but does ask more detailed questions about types of loans. And we found, here we looked, this is just giving you one picture across the Great Recession. This is the proportion taking out payday loans by degree of household head. In 2007 and in 2009, associates, households headed by someone whose highest degree earned as an associate's degree have the highest likelihood of taking on payday loans in both 2007 and 2009, and they go up with that recession. You'll see that not a lot of people take out these kinds of loans, but this population, this group, is particularly susceptible to doing so. The advanced degree, you might notice, hey, I'm used to seeing 5 groups. I only see 4 here. You know why that is? Because the post-bachelors do not take out payday loans. there's almost a non-existent category of advanced degree holders who take out payday loans. I don't think that's about education. I think that's about structural position, but advanced education probably has something to do with it. Okay. So this is a not very interpretable graph that tells you that I've been futzing with to tell you, these are post-estimation predictions that tell you, and this is what I want to say, here's what I say. Riskiest debt, least risky secured debts, okay? Everyone here has less of the debt than associate's degree holders. Every group here has less of the debt than associate's degree holders. Everyone here has more of the type of debt than associate's degree as their highest degree holders. And what you can see is that the associate degree holders really look distinctive right in here, right? They're not as likely, the less educated groups are more likely to have the really risky debts, but they're living in this space of consumer debt. So for me, what this says is there's a structural challenge in terms of these folks not being able to meet not being able to seek their educational goals while being able to maintain a relative financial solvency. But in addition, there may be an education piece here. I mean, you all know better than I do what the relative, how much you can move this when people are struggling. I'm going to skip the next two questions, okay? But I can give you the short answer because I'm getting close to my time. I can tell you that we've done a lot of testing to assess whether that riskier debt profile of a debt profile that is heavier on unsecured debts than on secured debts, and that is a mix of student loans as well as consumer debts versus secured debts. It's a debt profile that's carried into adulthood, even up to age 30. There are lots of negative consequences associated with this. There are higher levels of student default for these populations, lower financial well-being. They're more vulnerable to economic downturns. They're more likely to have a higher proportion of their income dedicated to student loans during economic downturns than other populations. So in other words, this isn't just we're not just asserting that the debt profile leads to more precarity. We find that that they're more likely to have difficulty over time. And just as a very quick little one mechanism I talked about, I think there's lots of mechanisms that we're exploring. What this graph just very briefly gives you a picture of is the different life course trajectories of these different educational groups. So one factor for these one of the reasons why these strivers, these associate degree holder strivers, have worse and riskier debt portfolios, we suspect, has to do with the fact that they're managing a lot of life transitions at the same time as getting to college. So this is life course. Let me show you the life course tradition for the average of the bachelor's degree holder. First move out of parental home. Not everybody has a parental home, but you know what I'm saying. Getting degrees. These are associates and bachelors. This is first cohabitation, first marriage, first child. Looks familiar, doesn't it? This is the sort of story about, right, the sort of standardized normative story about how the transition to young adulthood should go. Of course, we know there's lots of bachelor's degree holders who do not follow this. But nevertheless, on average, this is what it looks like. And you'll see, of course, that this cohabitation piece, which has become much more common, is very, very common in this cohort. For the associate's degree holders, the transitions are closer together, and you get the first child earlier in the life course. So we think that some of what's going, we're digging through this. This is just a kind of little snapshot of where we're headed. We're trying to understand more about how those dependents and so on matter. Okay. I won't summarize because I've summarized a couple times. I really think this isn't. I really think that the real college debt crisis that students are experiencing is that they're getting pressed from lots of different ways, and that they don't, and that there's a crisis in living standards and capacity to have a decent life while going to college. And of course, Sarah Goldrick-Grab and others have made similar arguments that tuition is not. I mean, tuition matters. I'm not. This is the professor who says don't worry about tuition. It's rather self-serving. Of course, tuition matters, and I think there's certainly things that higher education institutions need to do to control costs. But there's also a lot that the state and federal government have to do to help control costs potentially too, if we want to invest in the public good of higher education. But the broader issue is that we have an affordable housing crisis. We have a labor market crisis, so that you have minimum wage jobs don't support people. My mother went to college. In the summer, she earned enough to cover her tuition by working at a pickle factory. That is not as possible as it once was. And so really what we have is our strivers. What you can see, I think one of the things that our results really put a highlight on is that the strivers, the people who are trying the most, who have potentially the very most to gain from getting college, are the ones under the greatest financial burden. And that broader context of financial insecurity is, I think, insufficient. Maybe all of you are highly aware of it because you're in the trenches and you're seeing students. But I think in the broader public policy debate, not enough attention put on this. And my view is that debt is a really important piece of this. It's not just about the housing and the food and the kind of factors that people need to make a living, but it's also about managing and dealing with those debts. And finally, I think I probably part from some in this area, and I don't think higher education institutions can solve all these problems. And in fact, part of what a lot of people say, two-year colleges are the solution to the affordability problem. A lot of states like Ohio, but many others, are saying, look, the way to solve affordability is we get students to go to the two-year college first and then go to the four-year. Our results suggest there are perils to thinking that that's going to solve the affordability problem. And one piece that we're looking at now in our kind of looking more at the pathways and the transitions is whether students are taking too long, the kind of trade-off between time and investment in debt and loans, if that's part of why the associate's degree holders look worse, because they have a kind of thought that they're going to the cheaper place, and so they can take a little more time and they can take a couple courses here and there and so on. So it's depressing, I know. And finally, I feel confident in saying, as I said earlier, that this is not, although for simplifying, we're trying to kind of get some clear take-home points focused on these associate degree holders. I think a lot of these same points hold more broadly for the population of students who are not getting bachelor's or higher degrees, who are engaging with the 80% of young adults or 75% of young adults who are engaging with the higher ed system, not all of whom are getting degrees. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.